Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Today's episode is the second of a two-part series on the significance of 1066 and the Norman Conquest. Once again, my co-host is my good friend, Dr. Jennifer Paxton of the Catholic University of America. Welcome back, Jenny.
Thank you, Richard. It is great to be back.
And it's always great to have you on the podcast. In our previous episode, we reviewed how historians have interpreted the Norman Conquest through the ages and broadly outlined some of the changes wrought by the conquest. In this episode, we will go into some detail about how the Norman Conquest changed England politically, legally, socially, ecclesiastically, and economically. Jenny, I recently read the handbook that you prepared for that excellent series you did on the Norman Conquest for the teaching company. That was back in 2012, right?
Yeah. That's right.
In it, you began by asking, quote, why it matters that William conquered England. Was it really a turning point in the history of England and perhaps Europe as well? Why should we care about it today? So let's begin with the answer that you gave there and whether you would add anything new to it now.
Gladly. So I identified several reasons that the Norman Conquest really could be described as a turning point in the history of England. And the first is that it truly made England a part of continental Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Not to interrupt so quickly, but I'm going to anyway. We have to add that an earlier conquest, that by the Danes in 1016, had made England, for at least a time, part of a different region in Europe, Northern Europe. Under Canute and his sons, England was, and as you yourself point out, part of the Scandinavian world.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, one of the really fun things that's happened historiographically in the last couple of decades is that people have paid a lot more attention than they used to the conquest of 1016, and they've given it more prominence alongside the conquest of 1066. But even before the Norman Conquest happens in 1066, the Scandinavian element has been undermined by the restoration of the previous English dynasty, because Edward the Confessor, a representative of the old Anglo-Saxon line, takes over in 1042.
Yep.
So after 1066, England is looking towards France and the rest of continental Europe. It's not so much looking north to Scandinavia. So that means that England is going to be really in the mainstream of all of the major cultural currents affecting Europe, including the great changes that are taking place in religious circles. They're going to be part of that sooner than if they had been really a part of the Scandinavian world.
Yeah, but we also have to point out that English culture and political and legal institutions weren't completely swept away by the conquest.
No, they were not. And in fact, the Normans didn't even want to do that. English culture and English institutions were very strong, and they really held their own. They survived, but they also blended with the elements that the conquerors brought in. So you really see an adaptation and something new emerging out of the conquest. You get a really rich hybrid of English and Norman.
And that hybrid culture is exemplified by the English language itself, our language, what we have now.
It certainly is. It's the crowning glory, I think. English is a language that has a larger than average vocabulary because it contains English versions and French versions of many words. So you have many, many more semantic choices than in, say, one of the Romance languages alone. And this makes English a very flexible and effective tool for communication because you can find precisely the right word.
Yes. Any other changes that you would now add to that list of changes that you made back then?
Sure. Over the last decade or so, a lot of work has been done on the economic and landscape changes introduced by the Norman Conquest. We have new techniques for exploring these questions that we didn't have before, so we should talk about that too.
And we will. Now, I would add a couple of other topics, both of which I know you're familiar with. The first is the dreaded medievalist F word, feudalism.
Oh no, feudalism.
Whether the Norman Conquest introduced feudalism into England, that might fall under changes to English political and social institutions. The second is perhaps one that we really ought to begin with. What it was like for the generations immediately after the conquest. Were the Normans and the English antagonistic towards one another? Were the native Saxons really depressed into servitude under the Norman yoke, as parliamentary supporters in the 17th century posited, and as the Robin Hood stories and movies that many of us grew up with take it for granted?
Well, there certainly are signs there was some ethnic tension after the conquest. After all, the English and the Normans are very proud peoples. They have a long history behind them by 1066. And as we're going to talk about, many English monasteries had Norman abbots imposed upon them. And this was often done against the will of the monks. And actually, in some cases, led to outright conflict. And in Glastonbury in 1083, blood was shed. A new abbot tried to bring in customs from Normandy that the English monks didn't agree with, and people came to blows. And there is nothing that gets monks more agitated than changing the way they do the monastic office.
Oh, yeah.
This is their daily thing. And so you change that, you really...
And you have to be really upset that you're bringing in a foreigner to be your abbot.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Not somebody being promoted from within.
Who the abbot is makes such a difference in a monastic community. There's also evidence that Norman men who adopted the English custom of wearing full beards and long hair were made fun of for being too English.
Yeah.
Okay, but that does tell you, first of all, that some of them are doing that, right? So they're not so against fitting in with the English that they're not willing to say, well, I like that hairstyle.
But having looked at Charlton Heston's portrayal in the movie The Warlord with that bowl haircut that he has that comes straight off of the Bio Tapestry, I can imagine why you would want to adopt English fashions.
We don't see it necessarily as a flattering do.
No, I don't think so.
Right. But the remarkable thing about the ethnic tension is that it didn't really last very long. And I think the fact that the Normans didn't do very much on an institutional level to perpetuate it really explains this. They're really not about creating any sort of permanent separation between the communities. They don't set up any sort of apartheid or anything like that. For example, they don't change the law to favor themselves, except in a few very rare cases.
Yes. And the rare case that I really enjoy, the exception that proves the rule, and that's a wonderful idiom. Let me talk about that idiom for just a few minutes before we do it. The Latin legal principle is exceptio probat regulam, and it literally means the exception that proves the rule, but probat doesn't mean prove as much as it means test.
It actually means to try.
To try it.
Right? As you try
to put it to trial.
Yeah.
Exceptions imply that a rule must be in place that cover all other circumstances. And this particular exception is the murderum fine. It's the most notable exception to the law being the same for Norman settlers and the native English. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the murderum fine was?
Absolutely. The word murderum is, as you'll probably expect, related to the word murder, and it is a penalty for murder, specifically for secret murder. So in post-conquest England, this murderum fine was a penalty imposed on the surrounding community if a Norman was found dead, clearly due to foul play, like there's a knife in his back or something like that, and there's no explanation. People are just like, well, I don't know why this happened. And the idea of the fine is to put financial pressure on the perpetrator to confess his crime for the good of the rest of the community, because otherwise everyone
is going
to have to pay. And you're in a face-to-face society. People are probably going to know who did this, and they're not going to appreciate it if, sort of anyone who suffered collective punishment in elementary school, know that it's not fun. And so the other possibility is that somebody could rat the person out.
Yes. And what I thought especially interesting is that the murderum fine was not introduced by the Normans and originally did not single out Normans.
No, and indeed, this is one of those instances in which the Normans were particularly good at adapting something they found when they got there. So they figured out what the lay of the land was, and they figured out what we wanted to use. And this comes from our very good friend Bruce O'Brien, in a wonderful work that he wrote about this. That this fine dates back to that other conquest of England that we were mentioning a moment ago, during King Canute's reign, when the law was put in place, and this was to protect Danes from being picked off one by one by the English. So there's a recognition here that Norman Conquest is really Danish Conquest 2.0.
Yes, it really is. And both of them imply at least some tense relations between a small number of conquerors and a resentful, subjugated population. But there's also an explanation for the murderum fine arising from the nature of English law itself. Homicide in Anglo-Saxon England was an offense against the victim's kinsman and the victim's lord. Blood feud would follow unless compensation was made. Both the Anglo-Saxon monarchy and the Anglo-Saxon church encouraged monetary compensation. This is called the payment of weregild, man prices, in place of the violence and social instability of feuds. Anglo-Saxon law from King Alfred on did not prohibit blood feuds, but required that homicides be adjudicated in hundred and shire courts and regulated how a feud might be conducted. The weregild of the Thane was 1,200 shillings, which is an enormous sum of money. The homicide of a commoner was to be compensated by 200 shillings, which for the kinsman of a churl would have been a very large sum of money to pay. So the prospect of blood feud combined with the prospect of weregild payment were a check on violence. But in the case of foreigners who had no kin to protect or avenge them, other protections were needed. The weregild paid for the death of a merchant, for instance, would be split between the king and the merchant's guild brothers. The other English legal principle that underlay the murderum fine was the notion of communal responsibility for bringing a wrongdoer to justice. In late Anglo-Saxon England, when a boy reached legal age, believe it or not, 12 years old, he was placed in a tithing, a group of 10 men, each responsible for the good lawful behavior of the others. By the way, this actually survives the conquest, although it gets changed in name to Frank Pledge,
right.
But it's the same sort of thing. If one committed a crime, the other 9 would either have to bring him to justice or pay the fine for his crime. The murderum fine, in other words, made the entire community into a tithing.
Now, this fine had fallen into disuse under Edward the Confessor because, of course, he's a native Anglo-Saxon, right? So
yeah.
He hadn't really grown up there, but that's a whole other story. But the Norman kings revived this institution and just substituted Normans for Danes. And this is so that Normans would be protected from assassination. And gradually, the law came to be extended not merely to Normans, but to all free people, so non-serfs.
Yeah.
So the specific ethnic meaning didn't last. And I don't think that the meaning really was ethnic in the first place, really at all. It was functional. It was newcomers. It was conquerors.
People who didn't have roots in the community, people who didn't have part of the lordship or the kinship community.
Right.
Yeah. Now, the murderum fine does imply that at least some Danish and Norman settlers had been killed by disaffected locals. Why do you think these initial tensions abated, or did they?
Well, they did. And one reason, I think, for this blurring of ethnic identity in legal terms is that the Normans themselves didn't place a huge value on concepts of ethnicity. So they're not really policing the purity of Normanness or anything like that. For example, they very readily intermarried with the English, very readily, in fact. They were quite happy to marry the daughters of English landowners so that they could inherit their lands. And in fact, there's a lot of emphasis. We think of them, and very justifiably so, as a kind of a bunch of conquering thugs. Sure, they were that. But they're also quite interested in establishing legal title to their land. And doing it via marriage was one of the things that really kind of bulletproofed
Yes.
their title. So they were very happy to do that. And it actually went the other way, too. There are instances in which English men married Norman women. And very famous instance of this is William the Conqueror giving his niece Judith in marriage to Earl Waltheof, who had actually very unfortunate Earl Waltheof, who had actually been one of the English rebels in 1068. So this is clearly one of those marriages designed to create an alliance and paper over a gulf. And William obviously thought this was going to be politically helpful, and he didn't object on ethnic grounds to his niece marrying an Englishman.
And we could add to that King Henry I's marriage to Matilda of Scotland, the daughter of St. Margaret of Scotland, who was herself the granddaughter of King Edmund Ironside. This reintroduced the blood of the House of Wessex into the Norman dynasty and in today's monarchy of Britain.
That's right. They really do descend from the right line of Cerdic of Wessex.
Yes, it does. But in the case that you mentioned, it didn't end up really well for Waltheof, did it?
No, it didn't. And this is a kind of ironic reason. Waltheof had survived a revolt against King William led by English people. Right? So he'd been in that.
He was been in that right at the center.
Fully fledged person. He'd been pardoned for that. But then he kind of got sucked into a revolt in 1075 led by Normans. And we have to remember, of course, that the number one kinds of people who revolted against William the Conqueror were Normans.
Yes.
Right? Because
it was a Norman tradition.
Absolutely. I mean, the Duchy of Normandy is
brutally violent.
Rebels all the time. But this is the one that got him killed, the one that he was in with other Normans. He was at a wedding feast with some of the Norman lords who were now connected to him via his Norman wife. And so he kind of, it's sort of like, he turned out as the getaway driver or something. And he didn't really have a huge role in it. But this is where the conspiracy was hatched. But it was revealed early on.
And some say it was revealed by Waltheof
himself. Yeah. And this is where I have to say I'm going to give us a mark against our friend William the Conqueror here.
Yeah.
The Norman plotters were pardoned, but Waltheof did not. And we are told that this is because it was the English custom to impose the death penalty for treason. And so since Waltheof was English, he should be treated under English law. And thus he is the last English rebel to die in the generation of the conquest. Now, so we have a paradox in this encounter between English and Norman, and the fate of poor Earl Waltheof kind of sums it up. He dies because he's English, but he had only fallen into the crime of treason because his Norman in-laws got him into it. But, they clearly trusted him enough to
bring him into the plot.
That's right.
And he got screwed.
He did.
Okay, just to push back a bit, while the Normans may not have thought in terms of ethnicity, they did an extraordinarily good job of grabbing a vast majority of the land and wealth of the kingdom that Duke William conquered. To go by William the Conqueror's great land register, Doomsday book, 20 years after Hastings, well, some say 5%, but most recently it says about 8% of all the secular land holdings in England remained in native English hands. The rest were held by the crown, William's family, by Norman lords, by Bretons, by Flemings, and other Frenchmen who aided in the conquest. This didn't go unnoticed by 12th century Anglo-Norman historians. The secular cleric Henry of Huntingdon observed as he looked back from his vantage point in the third decade of the 12th century that, quote, "There was hardly a nobleman of English descent left in England, but all were reduced to servitude and mourning, so that it was a disgrace to be called an Englishman," end quote. Henry's contemporary, the historian Orderic Vitalis, expressed a similar sentiment.
Well, it's also worth pointing out, though, that Henry of Huntingdon and Orderic Vitalis were both of mixed Norman and English descent.
Yeah.
They were the sons of clerics who married English women. This was the sort of the last generation where you could get away with doing that as a cleric. Clerical celibacy is kind of coming in at this point. But so they come from this mixed background, and they seem to have both kind of inherited a strong identification with the English tradition from the maternal line.
Yeah, and they probably did inherit that. One of the reasons I think that they wrote is that they needed to explain to themselves and to the other monks why the English had suffered such a disaster. And being clerical writers, the answer was obvious. It had to be God's will, and it had to be God's punishment for the moral and religious failures of the English people.
And I have to say that all of us as historians of this period have to be extremely grateful to that sentiment, because the fact that they felt that the conquest needed explaining means that there's this giant efflorescence of historical writing in the early 12th century that
and
makes
good,
it a great
solid
period.
Historical writing.
Really good. Really good. I mean, in a sense, you don't get that sort of group of incredibly good historical writers in England for centuries thereafter.
For centuries.
I mean, people are spoiled if they work on the first part of the 12th century. So, though they were not quite as blatant as the 6th century Welsh historian Gildas was in writing about the coming of the Saxons to Britain, they certainly did go on a tear about how much the English had deserved their fate.
Now, the long and short of it is that within 20 years of the conquest, the great landowners of England were Normans. The prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England project, which is a massive research project headed by Chris Lewis and Stephen Baxter, allows us to appreciate the magnitude of the change. In 1086, Doomsday Book records around 1,150 tenants-in-chief. That's simply a technical term for individuals who held their lands directly from the king. The overwhelming majority of these people were Normans. In 1066, the lands they held had belonged to 37,000 individuals, virtually all of whom had been English. Of the 1,150 lay tenants-in-chief in 1086, only 44 can be identified specifically as English, and only 2 of those had possessed what we would call baronial status. If we include subtenancies, 20 years after the conquest, 92% of the landed wealth had been transferred from native English landowners to the Norman and French followers of the conquest.
I mean, that is really an absolute revolution.
92%.
It is a tenurial revolution.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Now, I think this is a good moment to honor the passing of Stephen Baxter, who died just a month ago at the sadly early age of 56.
Yeah.
He was Baron Fellow and Tutor in Medieval History at St. Peter's College and Clarendon Professor of Medieval History at the University of Oxford, and he was among the most distinguished historians of Anglo-Norman England of our generation.
He was. I only met Stephen Baxter on a couple of occasions. You know, these are the conference acquaintances and friends that you made. But I learned a great deal from his work on Doomsday Book and from his book on the Lords of Mercia. The prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, which identifies by name all of the Anglo-Saxon individuals we find in charters and Doomsday Book. This is a lasting monument to Stephen Baxter's memory. He was not only an outstanding historian, but from what I've been told by those who knew him, a dedicated teacher and a generous colleague. He'll be greatly missed. Okay. Back to the Norman settlement. The disposition and redistributions of lands was a gradual and sporadic process. In part, it was the consequence of English resistance and rebellions that took place between 1066 and basically 1069, but up to 1076. William the Conqueror began his reign by confiscating lands of all those who had fought against him at Hastings and distributing those lands as rewards to his followers.
Except for royal estates and those that had been held by the house of Earl Godwin, which he kept for himself. And obviously that's because he is positioning himself as the legitimate successor.
Yes, and in a sense, he benefited from the union of the Godwinson lands with the crown lands under Harold. which really increased the power and wealth of the King of England.
It is really remarkable, actually, how William is able to totally transform the political situation after the conquest, creating something that is far more favorable to the monarchy and cuts out from under them the legs of the most important aristocrats, because there had been overmighty subjects.
Oh, the history of late Saxon England is the history of overmighty subjects and the king trying to tamp them down. And after all, the Godwinsons went into full rebellion in 1051 against Edward.
And they essentially won.
But after the conquest, after the redistribution of land, there was no individual, no earl, no landowner in England who could come anywhere to match the wealth of the crown.
Absolutely. And their holdings were so scattered that it was very difficult for there to be any sort of regional threat the way that you could see in Normandy.
Yes, earls retained status. The title of earl was, which they probably thought of as Count Gomez, that the title of earl was important to have, but before the conquest, to be an earl meant you were a vice regent.
Yes.
After the conquest, it didn't mean that anymore.
No.
So what Stephen Baxter, what he and Chris Lewis did is they went through all of the records of Doomsday Book, writs and everything else to calculate that the royal domain in 1086 was valued at 17,787 pounds, which constituted 23% of the landed wealth of the realm. The royal domain of Edward the Confessor, by contrast, was only half of that. It was 8,230 pounds. The difference is explained by William's retention of the lands that had been held by Harold Godwinson and his brothers.
Every time there was an English rebellion, it was followed by further confiscation. So this scenario just got more and more favorable to the crown. So fortunately, in a sense, William provoked enough rebellions so that he was able to grow the crown estates. Now, the 11th century English and Norman nobility did share a culture that was shaped by the ethos of reciprocity. So good service to a lord looked for a return. And when you have this wave of rebellions and confiscations, this allows William to be a generous lord to his followers.
And the only way that he is going to keep their loyalty is by rewarding them for their service.
He has to do this, but he's able to do it within the framework of English law. So again, he has this ability to have it both ways, so to speak. He is, as we've said, regarding himself as Edward the Confessor's legitimate successor. So when he confiscates the lands of rebels, he sees himself and projects himself as exercising his legal rights as king. Now, we just mentioned this trial of a rebellion in 1051 by the Godwinsons. This is something that Edward the Confessor had done at the time to try to curb the Godwinsons, but it really hadn't worked. Okay? And this only accounts for perhaps a fifth of all the secular fees held by Normans and Frenchmen in 1086. Our friend Robin Fleming calculated that about a third of all of the lands that were transferred came from later territorial grants, often based on the 100, and the remainder from what Fleming called, very amusingly and euphemistically, private enterprise.
I love Robin's characterization of the Normans as a kleptocracy.
I don't
rule of thieves.
I would not disagree.
David Ruff, another friend of mine, has pushed back a bit, claiming that much of what appears to be Normans gobbling up lands of their unfortunate English neighbors had a legal foundation, as their English antecessors, that's a fancy word for their predecessors, had held what's called sake and soak judicial rights over the freemen who were recorded in the Doomsday Book as the holders of those small estates. In other words, the incoming Norman lords regarded those lands as subtenancies that had now passed to them along with the major estates of their ancestors. In a sense, Doomsday Book may hide the actual extent of land retained by Englishmen, as many may have remained as subtenants of Norman lords on lands that they once regarded as their own, and they're just simply numbered among the peasants, the unnamed peasants in the Doomsday entries. But when you put it all together, when I look at everything, I'm more persuaded by Robin Fleming than by David Roth's arguments. I think that the new Norman lords disregarded the distinction between Anglo-Saxon personal and Anglo-Saxon land lordship in order to take as much as they possibly could. They not only gobbled up the lands of lesser English neighbors, but whenever they could, they tried to grab the lands of each other. In 1086, William the Conqueror launched the Doomsday Inquest to determine who held precisely what in the kingdom that he had conquered. Doomsday Book was the end product of what amounted to a tenurial free-for-all, or to put it more genteelly, a tenurial musical chairs. In 1086, the music stopped, and whoever was in that chair got title to it.
I think that's very fair. Now, I remember you writing an article about the role that William the Conqueror's sheriffs played in this process. Do you want to say a few words about sheriffs?
In that article, I looked at the role played by William the Conqueror's sheriffs in the Norman settlement of the southeast Midland counties, where native landowners virtually disappeared. In Hertfordshire, for example, native landowners accounted for only 41 hides valued at £55 total in 1086, just under 4% of the county's total hideage assessment and only 3% of its valuation. Nearly half of the English landowners were tenants on lands that they had held freely in 1066. This was especially true of lesser free landowners, the king's sokemen and freemen. And the primary beneficiary of the depression of that particular class into subtenancy were the sheriffs of these counties. William's sheriffs were well positioned as well as well dispositioned to profit from their office and to take advantage of the turmoil of the times. William the Conqueror, as we've said, viewed himself as the rightful and legitimate successor to his cousin Edward the Confessor. Initially, he employed the sheriffs and royal officials he had inherited, but he soon began to replace them with Normans. These men did not transform, and I should emphasize it, they did not transform the office of sheriff. They performed the same duties as their English predecessors, but in a radically different social and legal climate. As a result, they emerged as enterprisers par excellence, though perhaps more along the lines of jackals than lions, since their favorite targets of opportunity were unprotected monastic establishments, lordless lesser thanes, and especially the royal sokemen with whom they dealt so often in their official capacity. They were abetted by the role played by lordship in Anglo-Saxon legal procedures. Success in the courts of the hundred and the shire before the conquest relied upon the support that a lesser landowner could obtain from a greater neighbor whom he had taken as his lord. Deprived of these lords by the wave of confiscations, these small landowners had to turn to their Norman neighbors, or in the case of royal sokemen, the sheriff. The cost they had to pay for protection was title over their lands, which they would now hold as subtenants. Uta Beauchamp, the sheriff of Bedfordshire and Buckinghamshire, was one of the sheriffs who did especially well for himself and for his family. He cobbled together such a great estate that catapulted this previously obscure Norman Beauchamp family into the upper echelons of Anglo-Norman landed society.
Well, the people who really didn't like these guys are 12th century monastic chroniclers.
Yeah.
They have nothing good to say about these sheriffs. There is a guy named Gilbert Pickett who had a lot of dealings with the Abbey of Ely, and the 12th century Book of Ely, the Liber Eliensis, goes into tremendous detail about his various depredations. And it's a sign of the fact that there wasn't really much they could do about him at the time, that he isn't really punished by the law, he's punished by the saint.
Yes.
Right.
Which is how Becket's murderers got punished.
Right.
They were punished by God, not
they're punished by God. And in this case, by Saint Withburga, who was an otherwise fairly obscure saint.
But an English saint.
Yes, but definitely an English saint.
Perfectly.
No question about that. You do not get more English than Withburga.
So, another sheriff, Ernst de Abbatow, sheriff of Worcestershire and Gloucestershire, achieved lasting notoriety. Ernst's castle building at the expense of a monastic cemetery so exasperated the elderly Archbishop Aldred that it provided a memorable curse. If thou hattest Ernst, thou be cursed. If you're named Ernst, you're cursed. I can imagine some Ely monk desperately trying to come up with a proper rhyme for peacock.
Oh, too bad they didn't. Unsurprisingly, by the 12th century, the English court and nobility, in terms of language and culture, were thoroughly Frenchified or Normanified or whatever you want to call it, right? Because I think that the French would not really have considered the Normans
as being French.
To be French, right? Beards and mustaches went out of fashion, and those Normans who adopted them faced ridicule.
Ridicule, yes. But some young Norman noblemen adopted the English practice of letting their hair grow long, though clerics and traditionalists regard this as somewhat feminizing.
They did, and this is how Admiral of Canterbury, Archbishop Anselm, and the 12th century monastic historian William of Malmesbury ended up regarding these people with long hair, specifically in the context of the court of William the Conqueror's successor, William Rufus, as degenerate.
I'm getting flashbacks to the 1960s and early 70s now.
Oh, very, very much. I mean, you can sort of imagine a little bit. Well, I mean, I don't think they're really flower children because they wouldn't have had those sorts of politics.
No, they wouldn't have.
But they would have been decadent.
Decadent, good word.
I think, bright young things.
We were decadent. We wore our hair long because I forget why.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Now, the implication is not only that these courtiers were adopting feminine fashions, but that Rufus's court is a hotbed of homosexuality. And William of Malmesbury is very explicit about this. Here's a quote from him. Then long flowing hair, then luxurious clothes, then wearing shoes with curved and pointed tips was all the rage. Softness of body rivaling that of women, a mincing gait.
I like the mincing gait.
Right?
Yeah.
Going around with dissolute gestures and naked flanks was the fashion of the young men. Effete and soft, unwilling to remain as they had been born, they conquered the chastity of others and threw away their own. Troops of effeminates and flocks of harlots accompanied the court, so that a wise man was not rash to remark that the court of the King of England is not an inn of majesty, but a brothel of mature male prostitutes. The technical term is exoleti.
Yes.
So I mean, that's a hater, right?
Yeah, that is.
Tom License, a wonderful modern scholar, gave a very persuasive paper at the Haskins Conference a few years ago, arguing that this is not just monastic propaganda, but William Rufus's court culture was in fact gay. But he cautions against using anachronistic terminology. That term doesn't exist. There's no such word as homosexuality yet. But certainly what he's arguing is that there was a culture of same-sex attraction.
And, the interesting thing for me is that if you look at William Rufus, he was an extremely successful warrior king.
Oh, sure.
So we may be talking about effeminacy, whatever that, but these young men considered themselves to be warriors.
We really have to be careful about projecting
our conceptions.
Modern stereotypes of what effeminacy
or
is.
even monastic stereotypes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I thought it was a really good paper, though I generally have problems with historians outing medieval figures.
I do too. The notorious case is that of Richard the Lionheart, where the medieval evidence is almost willfully misinterpreted. But Tom License's article is an exception. It's an excellent article.
I think it is. I do think that the Anglo-Saxon nobility would have resented the implication that their long hair was anything but fashionable and completely safely masculine.
Oh, totally, yes.
Yeah. William of Malmesbury's comment about luxurious clothing points up a change of fashion in the upper class, as the Anglo-Norman nobility were more in tune with continental fashions coming from Italy, for example, than their Anglo-Saxon predecessors had been. And they had greater wealth to spend on these clothing, on these fashions. But I think that you'd agree that the greatest cultural change was linguistic.
It certainly was. Starting with the names that the few English landowners who weathered the conquest gave their sons. So we're seeing how the wind is blowing here. Edward of Salisbury, who served William the Conqueror and his sons William Rufus and Henry I as Sheriff of Wiltshire, named his son Walter.
Yes.
Right. So Edward, very Anglo-Saxon name, names his son Walter. Other survivors' names gave their sons names like William, Robert, and Henry. So literally naming them after the sons of William the Conqueror.
Yes.
Like you're going super, super safe with these names. Generally, over time, Old English names become associated with the peasantry.
You know what this reminds me of? It's totally different context, but it does remind me of it. My grandparents on both sides were immigrants from Eastern Europe, Eastern European Russian immigrants. So what was my father's name? My father's name was Milton. There is no Milton. His sister's name was Eleanor. His older brother, and quite a bit older brother, was Joseph. Joseph is a nice Jewish name. Milton and Eleanor isn't. My mother's name was Blanche. Her brothers' names were Herbert and Alvin. It was a whole generation of Jewish immigrants so desperate to assimilate that they named their kids with what they thought were really good WASP names.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very human impulse, right?
Yeah.
You do want to fit in with the people who are calling the shots. So the language of the royal court and the law became French. Richard the Lionheart was fluent in French, Occitan, because he comes from the southwest of France, and he probably had a good working knowledge of Latin. Probably didn't speak English.
No.
And so that's the end of the 12th century, over a century after the conquest. And the reason this is possible is because he has a layer of people under him who are doing all of the communicating with.
He doesn't need them. You have translators.
Yeah, you've got people who are taking care of the daily kinds of stuff you have to use English for. And so English isn't the language of the royal court until Chaucer's period in the late 14th century. And that English is greatly enhanced by words borrowed from French.
Yeah, you take a look at Old English, it is a Germanic language.
Totally.
You have a better chance of being able to understand it if you know Dutch or German than if you know English. But you look at Middle English, all of a sudden it starts to become something recognizably English.
Yeah, there's a couple reasons for that. A lot of it is the vocabulary. And also the loss of cases and all these kinds of things, which is largely influenced by French.
Largely influenced.
Yeah. So in terms of legal procedure, English only replaced Norman French in the mid-14th century. The Statute of Pleadings in 1362 mandated that legal court proceedings must be done in English. And interestingly, this is the same year that Edward III became the first king to address Parliament in English. But by then, English was itself transformed by this infusion of numerous French words.
Yes.
Old English is clearly a Germanic language.
Middle English,
it's a hybrid.
Right?
Yep, absolutely. And I'll just tell you one really interesting aspect, the sort of late flowering of French as a legal language. And this actually comes from Ireland.
Ireland.
So there is a famous text called the Statutes of Kilkenny from 1367. This is often misinterpreted. This is a series of provisions that requires the English settled in Ireland to maintain their Englishness by only speaking English, by not marrying the Irish, all of these sorts of things. They weren't supposed to employ Irish bards, et cetera, et cetera. So this is about policing ethnic boundaries in Ireland in the 14th century. Well, the text is itself written in French.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't it? It really surprises students when I show them a text of the original.
I love that. At this point, this is what I was going to do. I was going to drive home the relationship between language and social status by pointing out that the words we use for meats that we consume, words beef, pork, mutton, veal, all come from French, while the names of the animals that produce these meats, cows, pigs, sheep, derive from Old English. Isn't that wonderful? Unfortunately, when I did a little bit more of research, because I just figured I should check this out, I found out that it doesn't quite work that way. That what I had long believed may not, in fact, be true.
So that's not true? That
It
means
may not be true.
I mean, I need to apologize to like hundreds of students over the years.
Same here. Here.
This is terrible.
Doesn't it make... Okay. The first recorded use of the words beef and mutton occur in England. That these first recorded uses date only to the early 14th century. We're quite a bit away from the conquest by then. And they are sometimes used for both the animal as well as the meat.
Well, which is true in French, of course.
Which is true in French as well, yeah. But, at least it's suggestive. I think it's still suggestive that the French-derived words have become associated with consumption, while the Old English-based words never did.
Right, and I think that certainly has something to do with it. May not be entirely caused by the conquest, but it could indirectly be caused by that association of England with French culture that begins at the time of the conquest. So I think we can rescue a little bit of this idea.
So let's not apologize quite yet.
Right, okay, there we go. All right. Now, it isn't surprising that the English court spoke French in the 12th and 13th centuries and probably much of the 14th. Historically, perhaps the most consequential effect of the Norman Conquest was, as we said, to tie England politically to France and thus to the rest of the continent. So for centuries after the Norman Conquest, kings of England are not just sort of influenced in a general way by the continent. They're also literally French dukes and counts. They are technically vassals of the King of France. So there is this absolute material tenurial tie that's keeping them looking across the channel. William the Conqueror spent most of his reign, in fact, in Normandy, defending Normandy against the French king and the Count of Anjou, his two most dangerous neighbors. Ironically, of course, England turns out to be the easiest of his territories to keep.
I know.
For Henry II and the Plantagenets in the 12th century, the English crown gives them status and wealth, but their time has to be spent more defending their French territories. Those are always, again, the ones most under threat. And this dynamic ultimately leads us to the 100 Years' War in the 14th century, where we have the King of England, beginning with Edward III, asserting sovereignty not only over their French territories, but over the throne of France itself, I think largely with the idea that it's going to be much easier if we just cut the Gordian knot and we're the kings of the place so that we don't have to have this awkward dynamic anymore where we owe homage to the French king.
And Edward III had a claim because his mother was a French princess.
He had a very good claim, if you ask me.
Much better claim than his Valois rival.
I would say.
Yeah. So that claim of being King of France remained part of the English royal title long after the English actually lost the 100 Years' War. By 1453, the only part of France that remained under English control was the city of Calais. And they lost Calais in 1558. But you know when the last English king used the title King of France?
I do know the answer, but why don't you tell everyone?
It was George III in 1800, and it was in 1801 that he formally renounced the claim. And this was after the French Revolution had abolished the French monarchy, and the Act of Union with Ireland had required a long overdue change in royal style.
Now, here's a fun thing if you want to really be a nerd, and you can look up.
Me, a nerd?
Okay. I think we both have to own this one. But if you want to check out heraldry from before 1800, the Royal Coat of Arms still has the fleur-de-lis.
Really?
Before that period. Oh, yes. Yes, it does.
Wow.
So that claim to France is reflected in the Royal Coat of Arms up until they finally renounce it. And so if you ever see that Royal Coat of Arms before 1800 without the fleur-de-lis, it's like in a historical movie or something like that, it's wrong.
It's wrong. Oh,
yeah.
That is interesting.
They have it right there. And can you imagine that maybe causing slight irritation on the part of the French?
Only slight. Only slight.
All right. So the Norman Conquest had profound consequences on the legal and political landscape of England. And I think it's time that we say a few words about that F word that you talked about earlier, Richard. When I was an undergraduate, medieval surveys taught that the Norman Conquest introduced feudalism into England. And this is your thing, so go on.
Okay.
Let's hear it.
Okay. Absolutely. Absolutely. Until the 1970s, the fiercest debate over the consequences of the Norman Conquest focused on the origins of English feudalism. The question was, did William the Conqueror introduce into England the conjoined institutions of vassalage, the fief, and knight service, just brought it in from Normandy in 1066, or whether the origin of these institutions is to be sought in Edward the Confessor's England? Those who wish to portray the Norman conquerors as the architects of the feudal system have minimized the resemblance of the royal army of pre-conquest England to the Anglo-Norman host. Anglo-Saxon lordship, they say, had nothing in common with Norman vassalage, and Anglo-Saxon land tenure had very little in common, they say, with the type of land tenure found in Doomsday Book in 1086 and 87. Now others, and I count myself among them, contend that the Anglo-Saxons developed dependent military tenures at least a century before Hastings. The argument extends way back. It extends to the 17th century when the antiquary Sir Henry Spelman, who died in 1641, first recognized the applicability of feudal terminology formulated by early modern French legal writers to describe the laws governing the descent of fiefs to the situation of medieval England. The modern debate, however, began in 1891 with the publication of an essay by John Horace Round on the introduction of knight service into England. Taking exception to Edward A. Freeman's argument for continuity in English tenurial and political history, Round represented the conquest as a dividing line between a pre-feudal and a feudal England. By the way, for Round, pre-feudal is bad, feudal is good and modern.
He really did like it.
Oh, he hated the English.
He did.
Hated the Anglo-Saxons, okay.
Yes, very pro-Norman.
According to Round, William the Conqueror revolutionized the military organization of England by imposing upon the fiefs he distributed to his followers precisely defined quotas of knight service. Round, who had previously argued that 1066 marked a tenurial revolution, posited that the Norman conquest marked a dramatic and absolute break with English traditions of military service, which he saw as arising from a public duty incumbent upon all free men. Now, Round's views pretty much carried the day. It was essentially the military corollary of an assumption shared by most Victorian scholars about the nature of early Germanic society. If Anglo-Saxon England had been a peasant commonwealth and constitutional monarchy as most believed it had been, it must have been defended by a militia of free men. But not everyone was convinced. The close study of Doomsday Book by Round's great contemporary Frederick Maitland convinced him that even if the Anglo-Saxon Royal Army, the Third, had once been the nation in arms, it had evolved by the 11th century into a proto-feudal host. Even if Round was correct that the conqueror had defined the amount of military service due him from each tenant-in-chief, it was doubtful that the Normans introduced quote-unquote any new principle, since the fyrd itself already contained tenurial and contractual elements. Another of Round's contemporaries, H. Monroe Chadwick, based on his study of Anglo-Saxon literature, posited that royal armies consisted of noble warriors who served under ealdormen to whom they had sworn loyalty. Chadwick was pretty much ignored until his views were revived by Eric John in 1960. My friend and mentor, C. Warren Hollister, took a different tack. He argued for elements of continuity between the military organization of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman England. More radically, he demonstrated that feudal military service never constituted the main source of warriors for the Norman kings. John Gillingham followed Hollister by critically re-examining the evidence for William the Conqueror's sudden imposition of night quotas. And David Bates screwed everything up by demonstrating that Normandy before 1066 was not as feudal as Round had supposed.
Right. So how could it have been the source of feudalism?
Yeah, if it wasn't feudal itself.
For England, right.
Yeah.
So now you might not be willing to toot your own horn, but I will. Your first book, Lordship and Military Obligation in Anglo-Saxon England, really was a huge contribution to this debate. And in that book, which I have read and admire, you show that in 1066, English armies were organized according to the principle of lordship, and they were raised through the obligation of those who held their lands freely to render military service to the crown. And really, all of the kinds of evidence you've just been talking about would point in that direction.
Yeah, and I also argued, and I still will say that I believe this, that the number of soldiers each landowner owed the crown was determined by a rough approximation of the value of his lands. Now, thanks for saying that the book is a major contribution to the debate, and I still stand by these conclusions. But ironically, while I was arguing for the existence of feudal-like institutions in pre-conquest England, the very validity of the feudal paradigm was coming under attack.
And this is a topic that you covered in a previous episode of the podcast, The Medievalist's F Word, which is a great episode.
It is. The consensus at present is that both England and Normandy possessed rudimentary elements of what we would call a feudal system. That is, both had lordship and dependent military tenures before 1066, but they coexisted with other forms of land tenure and other forms of military obligation. English feudalism, as presented in the works of medieval jurists such as Glanville and Brockton, was the result of an evolutionary process that had much to do with the unsettled conditions that followed the Norman Conquest. In other words, it's a creation of the Norman settlement itself. To be honest, the consensus at present is that we don't talk about English feudalism anymore. I feel so last century. Jenny, your work has focused on the post-conquest church. Did the Norman conquest have a really significant impact on the English church?
Well, the conquest impact on the English church was a mix. There was some continuity. For example, the new clerics did accept English saints. This is something that people used to doubt, but it really seems to me, from looking at all of the evidence and work that people have done recently, they did accept English saints and make them their own. But there was also some dramatic change. William did not fire all of the Anglo-Saxon bishops when he came to the throne, but he did replace them by attrition. Yeah. So every time one of them vacated its post, a Norman or a other foreign-born cleric was put in place. So by the end of his reign, the English bishops are almost completely foreign-born, and they're chosen because most of them represent the kind of reforming spirit that is prevalent in the church in Normandy.
And he does the same thing with abbots, right?
Oh, definitely. The same thing. I mean, abbots are really a part of the leadership of the church. Structurally speaking, they're not technically in the church hierarchy, but they're extremely important.
And it doesn't surprise me that he would do this. After all, we think of a separation of church and state, but they didn't.
They certainly did not.
And so the kings of England depended upon their bishops, and they depended upon abbots as royal officials. They needed to be able to work together with them. So you wanted people that you knew and you trusted in those positions.
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example of how this was the case. So Abbot Brand of Peter, no, not Abbot Brand. There's another abbot of Peterborough was actually present at the Battle of Hastings and was killed after the battle.
Yeah.
So these people are present at the most important events of the realm, including military conflict. So they're an integral part of the state, if we want to call it that.
Right, right. Now, the pre-conquest English church's resistance to the papacy's Gregorian reform of the middle of the 11th century was one of the reasons that Duke William was able to obtain the blessings of Pope Alexander II and conduct his conquest of England literally under a papal banner.
Which you can see on the Bayeux Tapestry.
Yes.
There it is, right? Now, the symbol of English clerical resistance to the Gregorian reform was Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, the euphoniously named Archbishop Stigand, who had received his archiepiscopal pallium from the anti-pope Benedict X.
Yeah, that's questionable, isn't it?
Really not so good. So Pope Leo IX and his successors refused to recognize Stigand as canonically elected. He had a lot of other strikes against him, too, such as being a notorious pluralist, which meant that he was ruling multiple churches at the same time, which you were not really canonically
supposed to do. He was the poster child for the pre-Gregorian reform.
He really looked extremely unreconstructed.
And William took that into account because he refused to get crowned and anointed by Stigand. He went to the Archbishop of York instead.
He absolutely did, which was a very unkind cut.
Yes.
Because the Archbishops of York and Canterbury were notoriously rivals for precedence, and you're really supposed to have the Archbishop of Canterbury do this. If you let the Archbishop of York do it, it hurts more than anything.
But it's part of William's desire to have legitimacy that be unquestioned.
Absolutely.
And so he needed to have Archbishop Ealdred be the one who would crown him rather than have the questionable Stigand.
He doesn't want an asterisk next to his consecration.
Yes. So William the Conqueror chose a much different type of cleric to replace the secular and worldly Stigand as Archbishop of Canterbury. Why don't you tell us a little bit about him?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Archbishop Lanfranc, who was brought in by William, had trained at the great abbey of Bec in Normandy, and he had been abbot of Caen. And this is the abbey that William had founded to atone for his marriage to his wife Matilda that had been just a little bit uncanonical.
Just a bit.
Just a little bit, yes. Lanfranc brought with him other clerics of the same stamp, and they brought a breath of fresh air to the English church. Lanfranc reformed the customs of the Church of Canterbury. He improved the liturgy. He promulgated the famous Constitutions of Lanfranc. Similar work is being done at many other English churches, and it wasn't always resisted by English monks. Many of them did welcome the changes. The English church certainly benefited in the long run from the Norman Conquest, just as William had promised the Pope that it would.
And Lanfranc was astute politically as well as pious religiously. He was able to work very closely with William. And in fact, he supported William when William came into his disputes with some of the English episcopacy or the Norman episcopacy. He supported him against Odo of Bayeux.
He did.
William's half-brother. And he supported him against William of St. Calais, making the nice distinction between being a bishop and being an earl in the case of Odo.
Right, absolutely.
We are not prosecuting or imprisoning Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. We're imprisoning Odo, Earl of Kent.
Absolutely. Yeah, Lanfranc and William worked together harmoniously in a way kind of hearkening back to Henry III, the Emperor Henry III and Pope Leo IX. Right? So back to an earlier stage of the Gregorian reform when you could have a prelate and a king on the same page, I think.
So what are the signs of continuity in ecclesiastical affairs?
Well, more dramatically, we have the Norman churchmen's acceptance of English saints as their own. There is some evidence that a few of the bishops and abbots that the new Norman kings put in place were initially skeptical about whether these new saints they were learning about really deserved veneration. But that's simply because they didn't know anything about them. They'd never heard of these people. Who are they? Nowadays, though, scholars are less convinced that there ever was any sort of great Norman effort to purge the English church of questionable saints, because, on the whole, the churchmen that the Norman kings brought in respected the traditions they found in place in England as soon as they were educated about them. And to a certain extent, I think this dispute can be an artifact of our sources, because it's a good narrative device to have a bishop or abbot say, I don't know who this person is, and then have some explanation of who that person is, because then you, reading the text, learn all about who this saint was as well. So sometimes we have to keep in mind that we're learning about these things. It is a little bit of exposition. And these Norman clerics, if anything, once they knew what they had to work with, they wanted to capitalize on these native traditions to create publicity, because publicity means donation. So they're figuring out essentially what's in my portfolio. What have I got?
And why would you give up having something valuable like saints and relics of saints?
Absolutely. And there's a huge wave of saints' lives being written at this period. Also translations of saints' relics. A translation is not anything to do with language in this case. It is literally moving something from one place to another. So the word translation, as we use it, is a metaphorical moving of something from one language to another. So this was a literal moving of the saints' relics, usually from some more obscure place in the church to some more prominent place. You make a new shrine, and it's something more conducive to pilgrimage, and everybody's happy because the pilgrims come, they make donations, and things go from there. So the Norman clerics are really behind this movement. They're quite happy to have prominent English relics treated with great veneration. And at these occasions,
you have the translation.
You have, at these translations, you have English and Norman standing side by side, venerating the saints. And often these saints turn out to be historical figures from the English past. And there's an example from somebody I've worked on. This is St. Athelfrith, better known as St. Audrey, which is, by the way, where we get the word tawdry from.
Really?
Yes, tawdry comes from St. Tawdry, from St. Audrey, right? Tawdry. Tawdry refers to the kinds of little bibs and bobs that you would buy at St. Audrey's fair, right? So something is tawdry if it is, really kind of déclassé.
Wow,
that's why.
I never realized that.
Yeah. So that's what that comes from. But anyway, so St. Athelfrith is an actual 7th century Anglo-Saxon queen who founded the monastery of Ely. And so when you are honoring St. Athelfrith, you are kind of simultaneously giving a nod to the Anglo-Saxon past and ratifying the present. And kind of everybody gets to be happy at this event. And the result of all of this joint worship is that the English and the Normans are united in their respect for an English saint, and the Normans are slowly being assimilated into the religious culture of the English church at the same time, of course, as things are changing in a Norman direction too. So you really get this hybrid coming out of the post-conquest period.
You do. But as I'm visualizing the translations of these relics, I'm seeing these Norman and English standing side by side in churches that look very different from the churches that were in England before 1066.
Well, this is the most obvious and visible change that happens in the church. It's a complete wholesale rebuilding of the important churches.
Yes.
Right. So initially what we're talking about is really cathedrals and major abbey churches. And that starts happening immediately in the generation after the conquest. This is a huge initiative. These are much bigger, much grander churches in the style that is in England referred to as the Norman style. It's the equivalent of what we would call Romanesque on the continent. These are massive buildings in stone with very solid walls, comparatively high ceilings, although not, of course, as airy as you're going to get later with the Gothic, and also quite a lot of very sophisticated sculpture, sculptured capitals and things like that. There are hints that some of this building work was resisted because some monks were sad to see the old churches go. And in some cases, the old churches were actually fairly new.
Yes, they were.
Some of these churches were less than a century old. They were pretty new, and they were being torn down and replaced. But once they saw the big, beautiful new churches, and particularly once people started flocking to them and making all of those very sought-after donations, the laments started to die away. Now, one of the striking things about this first generation of churches is that they look a lot like castles. And indeed, several of the most impressive early Norman cathedrals were built in places that had been part of the most difficult fighting in the immediate post-conquest period. So, for example, the Norman portions of Ely Cathedral, which is very much a hybrid now, many different eras, but the early parts, the towers look like turrets in a castle. It looks like a military building. And if you want to look at something that is more sort of unified architecturally, if you look at Durham, I think this is really the best surviving example of a Norman cathedral. And I have not, sadly, ever been able to go inside the cathedral at Durham, but I have gone past it in the train, and it is just a dominant building.
I have never been to Durham.
It's on my, as they say, on my bucket list. It's really, it hovers over the whole town. It's on a promontory above the River Wear. And if you think about what it would have been like in the late 11th century, when there would have been nothing even close to it in scope, it would have really been
It's impressive
dominant.
when you approach Ely for the same reason, because
Ely
it's all flat. Well, it used to be marsh. And
it's very similar.
And it just rises out.
My first sight of Ely Cathedral from the train was breathtaking as well.
I'm going to piggyback off your observation that Ely Cathedral looks a lot like a castle to talk a bit about Norman castle building. The Norman conquest and settlement ended up dotting England with castles. Anglo-Saxon thanes had fortified residences, but the only castles that existed in England before 1066 were built on the Welsh marches by King Edward the Confessor's Norman kinsmen, Earl Ralph the Timid of Hereford, and two of King Edward's Norman favorites, Richard Scrobb and Osborne Pentecost. Between 1066 and 1087, the Normans erected more than 500 castles and maybe as many as 1,000. Only 85 of these were stone keeps, and the earliest of the stone keeps is the Tower of London. King William ordered the Tower of London built in 1078 to overawe the citizens of London and to deter them from rebelling against him.
Oh, for sure.
Don't even think about rising up against me. Look at the power that I wield, and the power is symbolized by this great castle, something you've never seen before.
Well, we just heard a paper a few months ago by our good friend Alan Cooper that looked at the evidence for the protracted resistance of London to the conquest in the fall of 1066. And that is certainly associated with the building of those fortifications. Of the places that revolt against him, London isn't really prominent among them.
Well, would you revolt?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm about to take students to the Tower of London. And certainly under medieval conditions, I wouldn't particularly want to attack that tower.
Yes. Along with the new cathedrals that Jenny talked about, the Tower of London and other Norman stone keeps are probably the most impressive visual symbols and signs of the transformation of England politically and militarily under the Normans. But I really need to emphasize that the Tower of London and these other stone keeps are pretty exceptional, that they're not the ordinary Norman castle. Because they were expensive and time consuming to construct, the conqueror ordered stone keeps built only where they were most needed, either militarily or politically. Some were royal castles, like the Tower of London. Others, like the keeps at Rochester and Richmond, were built by earls or bishops by order of the king. The other Anglo-Norman castles were far less impressive. These were what historians call motte and bailey castles, simple affairs that consisted of two main elements: a motte, that is an artificial earthen mound on which was built a wooden tower, the donjon. The term donjon comes from Latin dominum, meaning lordship, and a bailey, an enclosed defensible courtyard adjacent to the motte. Both were defended by a wooden palisade and a wide and deep encircling ditch, which most people would confusingly call a moat. And yes, the word moat derives from French mot, literally mound. This makes some sense because the ditch was not only a critical element of the defensive system, but also the source of the earth needed to raise the motte. The Bayeux Tapestry has a scene showing the construction of a motte and bailey castle at Hastings. Because they were made of wood and soil, most of the Anglo-Norman motte and bailey castles have all but disappeared into the countryside. Those in which the original wooden donjons were subsequently replaced by stone towers survive today as scenic ruins. It was once argued that this was done with the idea of creating a network of castles throughout England, sort of like what I speculated about Alfred the Great's burhs, this network of fortifications. But the work that's been done on them show that they're not sited that way. They're not really rationally sited on areas that are the best strategic area. Rather, they're placed at the center of the holdings of the new Norman lords on rising area that is high hills so that they could be seen from far away. They are visual symbols of the lordship of the new Normans. They're not really military as much as political statements of domination over the countryside. These castles become centers of economic activity, and they become important for transforming the landscape itself economically and just topographically.
Well, the urban landscape of 11th century England, in some cases, was dramatically altered by the introduction of the castle and the cathedral.
Yes.
Because you have the much bigger footprint of the Norman cathedral, and in some cases, the erection of a castle in the middle of a town caused the destruction of a number of urban dwellings.
And create tensions within those towns as well because of that.
Yes, absolutely.
I was told a while ago that one of the great changes that the Norman Conquest produced was the introduction of a new type of deer into Britain, the fallow deer. Right. And the fallow deer is the favorite of hunters. Turns out there is now archaeological evidence for the introduction of the fallow deer before the conquest, probably in the earlier part of the 11th century. But the evidence is that these deer lived long lives. They were parts of menageries because they were exotic and valuable animals. The transformation that was brought on by the Norman Conquest was the creation of deer parks for fallow deer to hunt them because they had reproduced so much that they became now a beast to go hunting for rather than something to prize and to show off to visitors.
So is this one of those examples of an invasive species?
Yes, it is. And another invasive species that the Normans brought in was the rabbit. There is no Old English word for rabbit. Anglo-Saxons had were hares.
Yes.
It took me a long time to realize there is a difference between a hare and a rabbit.
I have to look it up every time.
So that's another animal brought in as an invasive species, and they reproduce like rabbits to be hunted and for consumption. We are running long, but I did want to say a few words about the newest area of research on the impact of the Norman Conquest, how the Norman Conquest affected diet and the preparation of food. Most of the work to date has focused on changes in food culture among the political and economic elites brought about by French cultural influences. These include increased consumption of domesticated pigs, wild species like the fallow deer and rabbits that I mentioned earlier, and fish. The increased popularity of fish may be explained in part by the tighter observance of the Catholic Church's prohibition on eating meat or meat products on Fridays, a byproduct of the religious reforms that Jenny has just been talking about. Archaeologists have also found a shift away from dairy farming towards meat production at rural producer sites. How meat was cooked also changed. Typically, Anglo-Saxons had boiled or stewed the meat they consumed. The Anglo-Norman elite cooking style featured new methods of slow cooking and roasting. As I said, this research has focused on the food culture of the elites. In 2020, a team of archaeologists, osteologists, and isotope analysts from Cardiff University, the University of Sheffield, and the University of Bristol undertook to rectify this using the bioarchaeological methods that Dr. Alison Beach talked about in our previous episode. Their research question was, what impact did the Norman Conquest have upon the diets and health of ordinary townspeople in Oxford? To answer this, they examined the bones and teeth of 36 people interred in Oxford between the 10th and 13th centuries. In addition, they performed isotope analyses on the skeletal remains of 60 domesticated animals, mainly pigs, and organic residue analysis of ceramics used for cooking. Things, frankly, are a bit anticlimactic. They did find some changes in the dietary customs of the non-elites of Oxford, but on the whole, the Norman Conquest seems to have had little impact upon the diets and health of the townspeople. So what changed? Well, let me quote. Evidence of preference for certain foodstuffs and cooking techniques suggests that fashions documented among elite classes and at specific rural provider sites were also adopted into the everyday lives of those living in towns. There is evidence the Norman invasion led to more controlled and standardized mass agricultural practices. Pork became a more popular choice, and dairy products were used less. But on the whole, a diet dominated by vegetables, cereals, beef, and mutton remained largely unchanged. But their main finding was for continuity rather than change. And again, I quote, despite the huge political and economic changes that were happening, our analysis suggests the conquest may have only had a limited impact on most people's diet and health. There is certainly evidence that people experienced periods where food was scarce. But following this, an intensification in farming meant people generally had a more steady food supply and consistent diet. Aside from pork becoming a more popular food choice, eating habits and cooking methods remained unchanged to a large extent. End quote. The article appears in the Mega Science and Medical Journal, PLOS One, and I've provided a link to it in the show notes. At the end of our previous episode, Alison Beach said that she and Team Nunn were working with skeletal remains from a late Saxon parish cemetery in Bedford and from Elstow Abbey, a very posh post-conquest monastery for nuns in Bedfordshire that was founded by William the Conqueror's niece Judith. Allison told me that they are only in the beginning stages and that she really has no findings yet, but that she will let me know what they do discover about the impact of the Norman Conquest on health and diet at both sites.
Well, I think that makes sense based on everything that we've been talking about, because the most dramatic changes that come about as a result of the conquest really affect the English elite.
Yes, it does. The conquest does emphasize lordship, but that process had been going on before the conquest. It's not a radical change. So that the conquest itself, in terms of the everyday life of the English, probably had very little impact. Um, whether you were having your goods and taxes taken from you by a Norman lord or by an English lord really doesn't matter all that much to a peasant.
So class matters more than ethnicity.
It does. But I'll leave you with this, that one of the real changes is not the abolition, but the disappearance of chattel slavery.
Yes.
Anglo-Saxon England was still a slave society. Not a not a huge number of slaves. Maybe 10% of the population by 1066 was still enslaved. But slavery had already disappeared in Normandy and in much of the continent. It had disappeared to be replaced. The replacement is serfdom. You're no longer chattel slaves, but now you are tenants bound to your tenures. And that process took place in England, so that England lost its chattel slaves and gained in its place its serfs. And this is not really good news for the general population, because it's not the slaves who simply become serfs. It was the free peasants who became serfs.
Certainly some of them.
So what we have here is perhaps the only real justification for talking about a Norman yoke. And returning to the elites, one of the great changes that we're going to see is the introduction of chivalry. Chivalry both in terms of warfare. This is no longer going to be a society in which warfare is about killing noble enemies. Instead, you're going to take them as your honorable hostages, captives, to hold them for ransom, and also chivalry as a matter of court culture.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think you really do start to see the contours of the medieval social structure that we will know and love for the next several hundred years.
Next several hundred years. And I think with that, we have concluded this episode.
It's been lots of fun, Richard. Thank you so much.
It's always fun to have you on the show. It's always great. So until next time, bye for now.